This week, Democrats renewed the push for slavery reparations. Just over 10 years ago, all the main Democratic presidential candidates were against reparations. Now, in 2019, nearly all support it. If you are against the reparations for slavery, they'll tell you that you're a racist. It's just the latest in the long line of divisive positions from Democrats. I'm your host, Jared Dyson, and this is the Closet Conservative Podcast. On Wednesday, civil rights activists descended onto Capitol Hill in an effort to push for H.R. 40, a bill that proposes a national commission to study the long-term effects of slavery and any recommended reparations that should be made for the descendants of slaves. Now, let me start off first of all by saying that I do not agree with slavery, and I think it is a permanent mark on U.S. history that is an embarrassment. These events happened over 150 years ago, and as a nation, we have moved on. Senator Mitch McConnell made a statement before the hearings on Tuesday that were both good and bad in what he said. He was correct in saying that the matter of slavery happened over 150 years ago and that no one alive now is responsible for it. This part of his statement is completely true, and I think it is a simple concept that most would agree with. Then Mitch McConnell continued on and made an absolutely absurd statement. It's something I would have not expected from him. As he continued, he said that the election of President Obama helped address the racial injustices of slavery. His statement is absolutely wrong. The election of Obama did not address racial injustice, but as a result of addressing racial injustice in the past. Senator Cory Booker and other activists spoke out in support of the bill and reparations. The activists claim that there are victims of racism still today and that they deserve something for these racial injustices that they have experienced. The events that they cite as justification of these things are events that I do not support. The problem is that these things are not a result of slavery, but a result of racism and the continued push by Democrats to create a racial divide in our country. I'm not naive enough to believe that racism is dead. Growing up in the South, I have seen racism. I have spoken out against racism. The question for Democrats is how you can expect racism to go away when you consistently push for special treatment for anyone of color. There seems to be a constant claim on behalf of people of color in claiming white privilege, and they're asking for privileged treatment to combat this supposed white privilege. Am I the only one that sees the irony in these statements? Earlier in the week, I wrote on the blog and talked about how the concept of reparations is nearly an impossible feat anyway. How do you determine who is eligible to receive reparations? Much of genealogy is family stories and history that is passed generation to generation. Now, I'm sure there are some high-profile cases that we can track, but how do we prove who's eligible for these reparations? Who makes the decision who's eligible? Are we going to go so far to say that only a panel of African Americans can decide who is eligible, since any white person may act with racism or bias? Who's responsible to pay for the reparations? Looking through my family history, I've found no record of slave ownership in the past. Am I responsible to pay reparations just due to the fact that I am white? Michael Knowles over at the Daily Wire had a great article where he discussed that one of the first slave owners was actually black. So are black people required to pay reparations to other blacks? Doesn't that seem to go against the general argument in the first place? There are a lot of other questions regarding reparations that have been brought up. In the same article, Knowles discussed how Indian nations continue to hold slaves for many years after other slaves were freed. Do those tribes need to pay reparations? Do we owe reparations to Native Americans for taking their land and driving them to reservations? Do we owe reparations to the Asian descendants who have faced racism and discrimination since their arrival in the U.S.? Maybe we owe reparations to those Chinese students who were discriminated on by Harvard just because they were Chinese. Reparations are a horrible idea because we have moved on as a society from slavery. I do not think that anyone sits around thinking that slavery is okay and that we should bring it back. We need to address the bigger problem in our country, which is the inability to treat anyone equally. Democrats have long pushed this divisive culture in their policies. More than just pushing the reparations, Democrats have consistently pushed divisive topics, those ones against rich people, white people, straight people, religious people. There's many others. If you disagree, then you hate them and you're discriminating against them. Pushing these topics and these agendas plays on the emotions of those involved and leads to division in the country among the various groups. Instead of focusing on how we can continue to divide the nation, maybe Democrats should focus on how we can unite the nation. The problem is that they're not interested in uniting the country. The Democratic platform is to simply press on the feelings of anyone and try to convince them not to take a stand for anything. After all, standing against the feelings or ideas of anyone on the left is to hate them. Disagreement is not hate, it's an expression of ideas. Read the stories of our founding fathers and the disagreements that they had. Our country once had pride in the fact that we could all have different opinions, but we could come together as Americans and reach a common ground. We have no common ground anymore, thanks in a large part to politicians who are more focused on pushing agendas and playing on emotions than addressing the real issues in our nation. Now just wait, because I made this podcast and now I'm going to be labeled as another conservative hate monger against anyone of color. The fact is that this couldn't be anything further from the truth. I believe that everyone is born equal, having an equal right and a value to life, and I would never treat anyone as a lesser human being. Just because I disagree with them does not mean that I have to sit silent in a corner, unable to express my opinion. It's time for Democrats to grow up and stop playing divisive politics with Americans. It's time to quit holding asinine hearings, ridiculous investigations, and start addressing the real problems in our country.
This is the Closet Conservative Podcast. All material copyright The Closet Conservative. Music courtesy of Greg Shields Music. Remember to subscribe to our podcast to receive all the latest episodes. We can also be found online at closetconservative.net or on Facebook and Twitter.